Hello, and welcome to Paint the Past. I'm your host, Amaris. If you've watched the last few episodes, you know I've done a lot of earth-toned paintings lately, and I needed a break from the ochres and the reddish browns, so today I've gone for something bright turquoise blue. Today, I'm painting something tiny but packed with history, a faience amulet of the goddess Bastet, seated and holding a sistrum. The original is in the Walters Art Museum in Baltimore, Maryland, and they've kindly released the photo I'm using as a reference to the public domain. The figure dates to Egypt's Third Intermediate Period, roughly 1070 to 664 BCE. That's about 3,000 years ago, give or take a century depending on which dynasty we're talking about, because this was a pretty fractured stretch of Egyptian history with multiple ruling families overlapping at times. We'll get back to that a little later, because it actually matters for why objects like this one were so popular. For now, let's start with the material of the amulet, because before we even get to the goddess, the substance this amulet is made from tells us something. This is Egyptian faience. And despite the name, it has nothing to do with French faience pottery, which came along thousands of years later. Egyptian faience is a sintered quartz material. Basically, that means you take crushed quartz or sand and mix it with some alkaline chemicals, shape it, and then it usually gets a glaze that's copper-based. That copper glaze is what produces that brilliant blue turquoise color you see on so many Egyptian amulets, beads, and tiles. The Egyptians had their own word for this material, tehennet, which translates roughly to that which gleams, or the dazzling thing. And if you've ever seen a piece of faience catch the light, you know exactly why they called it that. It has this glassy shimmer that looks almost like it's lit from within. The color wasn't just an aesthetic choice either. Blue and green held deep symbolic meaning in Egyptian visual culture. They evoke the Nile, the renewal of the fields after the annual flood, the concept of fertility, and by extension, rebirth and regeneration. So before we even get to the specific goddess being represented here, the material this amulet is made from is already loaded with meaning about life, protection, and renewal. Faience amulets were mass-produced using molds, which meant they were relatively affordable. These weren't exclusively luxury items for royalty. Ordinary Egyptians, including people of fairly modest means, could and did own small protective amulets like this one. Now, let's talk about Bastet, because her story is one of the more layered and complicated ones in the entire Egyptian pantheon. Bastet is one of the oldest deities we have evidence for in Egyptian religion, with worship going back to the early dynastic period, well over 1,000 years before this particular amulet was made. In her earliest forms, she was depicted as a lioness, or as a woman with the head of a lioness, and she was strongly associated with protection, specifically the protection of kings. Some scholars connect her early development to observations of lionesses hunting near a seasonal lake in the eastern Delta region, which over time fed into her identity as a fierce, vigilant guardian. As one of the Eye of Ra goddesses, Bastet occupied a fascinating role. The Eye of Ra was considered both part of the sun god and a separate, independent being, described in some texts as simultaneously being his mother, sister, wife, and daughter, which sounds confusing, but in Egyptian theology, these kinds of overlapping family relationships were actually a way of expressing a deity's power and centrality. The Eye of Ra had both protective and destructive capacities, and it was sent out, essentially, to do the sun god's bidding, including taking vengeance on his enemies. Bastet shared this role with several other major goddesses, most notably Sekhmet, Hathor, Wadjet, Tefnut, and Mut. These goddesses weren't entirely separate from one another in Egyptian thought. They were understood as different aspects or manifestations of one underlying divine feminine power. And under the right mythological circumstances, one could transform into another. This is a really common feature of Egyptian religion that can feel strange to modern audiences who are used to more clearly separated pantheons. The Egyptians were comfortable with deities blending, merging, and shifting, depending on the context and geographical region. The closest relationship of all was between Bastet and Sekhmet. The two were often described as sisters, or as two aspects of the same underlying goddess. Sekhmet representing the wild, destructive, bloodthirsty side, and Bastet representing the calmer, nurturing, protective side. Geographically, this pairing also mapped onto Egypt's basic political division. Sekhmet was associated with Upper Egypt, while Bastet was the protector goddess of Lower Egypt, the Nile Delta region in the north. Both goddesses were said to be wives of Ptah, the god of craftsmen and architects, and mothers of Nefertum, a youthful god associated with the lotus flower and the rising sun. There's a well-known myth involving these two goddesses that's worth telling, because it directly explains the imagery on this amulet. In the story, Ra, the sun god, growing old and frustrated with humanity's disobedience, sends his eye out in the form of Sekhmet to punish people. Sekhmet does this with such enthusiasm, slaughtering people across the land, that she essentially can't be stopped, even once Ra wants her to stand down. The other gods become alarmed that she might wipe out humanity entirely, so they come up with a plan. They brew an enormous quantity of beer, and dye it red so that it looks like blood, and flood a field with it. Sekhmet, in her bloodlust, drinks it all, believing it to be the blood of her victims, and promptly passes out from intoxication. When she wakes up, her fury has subsided, and in some versions of the myth, this is the moment she transforms into the gentler goddess Bastet, or alternately, Bastet steps forward to take over the role of the Eye of Ra from this point onward, with Sekhmet's wilder nature now contained. This story is sometimes connected to the origin of one of Egypt's famous religious festivals, the Festival of Drunkenness, celebrated annually, where Egyptians would deliberately drink to intoxication as a form of ritual reenactment, essentially recreating the moment humanity was saved through divine inebriation. It's a great example of how Egyptian mythology often had direct, lived ritual counterparts. The stories weren't just stories, they were blueprints for actual annual festival practices. So, with that in mind, here's where the sistrum in this amulet's hands becomes so significant. The sistrum is a rattle-like musical instrument, often U-shaped or loop-shaped, with small discs or wires strung across a frame so that shaking it produces a jingling, rattling sound. It was sacred to several goddesses, but mostly associated with Hathor and Bastet. According to Egyptian belief, the sound of the sistrum, that bright, joyful rattling, had the power to soothe divine anger. It was specifically used in temple rituals to calm Sekhmet's fury and to encourage the transformation into Bastet's gentler form. So this amulet isn't just showing us a goddess holding a musical instrument as a decoration. It's showing us the literal mechanism by which chaos gets transformed into calm, sound and music as a tool for managing divine temperament. That's a remarkably sophisticated piece of religious symbolism packed into an object that's only 5.5 centimeters or 2 inches tall. Beyond this specific myth, Bastet had an enormous range of roles and titles across Egyptian history. She was considered the daughter of Ra, and in some traditions, the daughter of Atum, the primordial creator god, depending on the theological tradition of a particular city or time period. Egyptian religion was never perfectly standardized, and different cult centers often had their own slightly different genealogies for the same gods. She was called the Lady of the East and the Goddess of the Rising Sun, and she was believed to accompany Ra on his daily journey across the sky, helping protect his solar bark. At night, in some versions of solar mythology, it's specifically a cat, sometimes identified as Bastet, sometimes as Ra himself in the feline form, that confronts and defeats the serpent of chaos, Apophis, who tries to swallow the sun before it can rise again. Bastet also served as a kind of divine nursemaid to the pharaoh. Her name has been interpreted by some scholars as meaning something like she of the ointment jar, which connects her to perfumes, oils, and healing unguents, giving her the epithet the perfumed protector. This ties her into the broader association with health, healing, and physical well-being. Interestingly, Bastet was considered the patron of what we now might loosely call firefighters, because the Egyptians believed that a cat running through a burning building would draw the flames toward itself and away from people and property. Whether or not that's how cats actually behave during a fire is a separate question, but the belief itself tells us a lot about how deeply Egyptians associated cats with protective, almost magical intervention in everyday domestic crises. By the time we get to the period this amulet was made, the Third Intermediate Period, after around 1000 BCE, Bastet's primary visual form had shifted decisively from lioness to domestic cat. This wasn't a random stylistic change. It reflects a real shift in how Egyptians related to cats themselves. Cats were enormously valuable in Egyptian households and granaries because they controlled the rodent population, protecting stored grain, which, in an agricultural society dependent on the Nile's flood cycle, was about as close to existential economic security as you could get. A goddess who could take the form of a small, watchful, fiercely protective domestic animal that quite literally guarded the household's food supply was an extremely relatable, practical kind of divine protector for ordinary people. This is also a good moment to talk about why this amulet exists at all, what it was actually for. Small faience amulets like this one were overwhelmingly produced for funerary purposes during this period. They were threaded onto necklaces, incorporated into beaded net shrouds that covered the mummy, or sewn directly into the linen wrappings at specific points on the body. The placement wasn't random. Funerary texts, including the famous Book of the Dead, contained detailed instructions about which amulets should go where on the body, and what protective function each one was meant to serve. The idea was that these objects would continue to protect the deceased in the afterlife, exactly as they might have protected a living person from illness, misfortune, or malevolent forces during their lifetime. A Bastet amulet placed with a mummy would have been invoking her gentler, nurturing qualities, guardianship of the home, in this context extended to mean the eternal home of the tomb, along with the comfort, healing, and safety she was believed to extend to mothers, children, and households in daily life. It's a lovely continuity of meaning. The same goddess who watched over your kitchen and your children while you were alive was asked to watch over you for eternity once you'd passed on. Now, let's talk about the absolutely massive party that was thrown in Bastet's honor every year, because this is one of the more vivid pieces of eyewitness history that we have from ancient Egypt, and it comes to us from a Greek visitor. Bastet's principal cult center was the city of Bubastis, located in the eastern Nile Delta. Its name is literally derived from hers, meaning something like the House of Bastet. Around 450 BCE, the Greek historian Herodotus traveled through Egypt and recorded his observations of Egyptian customs and religious practices. And his account of the annual festival at Bubastis is one of the most colorful pieces of travel writing to survive from the ancient world. According to Herodotus, pilgrims arrived to Bubastis by boat, in huge mixed groups of men and women. During the journey, some of the women played rattles, some of the men played flutes for the entire trip, and everyone else sang and clapped along. Whenever the boats passed a town along the riverbank, they'd pull ashore, and the festivities would briefly spill onto land, with some of the women apparently shouting and jeering playfully at the women of that town, before everyone got back on the boats and continued downriver. Once the pilgrims actually arrived at Bubastis, Herodotus describes the celebration as enormous. More wine consumed during that single festival, he claims, than during the entire rest of the year combined. As for how many people showed up, Herodotus puts the number at roughly 700,000, an extraordinary figure for the ancient world, and one that most modern historians treat with healthy skepticism, since ancient writers were often prone to rounding up dramatically for effect. Even allowing for significant exaggeration, though, most scholars agree this was almost certainly one of the largest annual religious gatherings anywhere in the ancient world at that time. A kind of ancient Mardi Gras, if you want a rough modern comparison, complete with music, costume, ritual mockery, and by some accounts, behavior that pushed well past the boundaries of everyday societal norms. That last point is actually backed up by other ancient sources as well, which describe women at the festival as being granted a kind of temporary freedom from the usual social constraints of Egyptian daily life, celebrating with uninhibited dancing, drinking, and music in a way that simply wasn't part of ordinary routine. Scholars connect this loosening of normal behavior to the festival's underlying themes of fertility, renewal, and the unpredictable, untamed side of feline nature. Appropriate, perhaps, for a goddess whose entire mythological identity was built around the tension between wildness and domestication. Bubastis itself became enormously wealthy as a direct result of all this pilgrimage traffic. It also became one of the major centers in Egypt for the mummification of cats, and archaeologists have uncovered staggering numbers of cat mummies associated with the site over the centuries, reflecting just how seriously this animal-goddess connection was taken in practice, not just in theology. These weren't simply beloved pets being honored after death, though many likely were exactly that. They were also votive offerings, animals specifically bred and mummified to be dedicated to the goddess as acts of devotion, in numbers that modern excavations have found almost difficult to comprehend. Bubastis's fortunes didn't last forever, though. After the Persian conquest of Egypt in the late 6th century BCE, the city's walls were dismantled, and it never fully recovered its former prominence. but its religious significance lingered for centuries afterward. When Greek-speaking rulers came to power in Egypt following Alexander the Great's conquest, they recognized Bastet as a counterpart to their own goddess Artemis, and her cult continued to attract worshippers well into that later Greco-Egyptian period. A nice example of how Egyptian religious traditions didn't simply vanish under foreign rule, but adapted, merged, and persisted in new forms. Which brings us back, finally, to the political backdrop of this specific amulet, the Third Intermediate Period. This was a stretch of Egyptian history marked by significant fragmentation. Instead of one centralized pharaoh ruling the entire Nile Valley, you often had multiple competing dynasties controlling different regions simultaneously. At times, rulers of Libyan origin to the north, while other dynasties held power in the south, and later on, a dynasty originating from Nubia to the south of Egypt would take control of the whole country. Compared to the more unified, centralized state of the New Kingdom that preceded it, this was a notably decentralized and at times politically unstable era. And yet, somewhat counterintuitively, this is also a period that saw a boom in the production of small personal protective amulets, faience figurines of household and family gods, exactly like the one I'm painting. Some scholars connect these two trends directly. When centralized state structures feel less stable or less reliable, personal religious practice often becomes more important to individuals. People lean more heavily on personal protective magic, household deities, and amulets worn close to the body, precisely because larger institutional sources of security feel less dependable. Whether or not that's the full explanation, it's certainly true that amulets like this one were produced in large quantities during this period, which is part of why so many examples survive in museum collections around the world today, including this one at the Walters Museum of Art. So what we're left with, in the end, is this, a tiny blue-glazed object about the size of your pinky finger that somehow manages to encode an entire worldview. The blue-green color speaks to renewal and the life-giving Nile. The seated cat form speaks to domestic protection and the practical, everyday value Egyptians placed on cats as guardians of the household. And the sistrum in her hands encodes an entire myth about the transformation of divine rage into divine calm through the power of music. Chaos tamed into order, danger turned into protection, all wrapped up in one small, gleaming object meant to travel with its owner from this life into the next. It always amazes me how much theology, history, and lived practice the Egyptians managed to compress into objects this small. This wasn't decoration in the way we might think of most jewelry today. It was portable belief, portable protection, and in its own small way, a portable representation of Bastet's history, a couple thousand years in the making. Thanks for joining me to meet the fantastic feline Bastet. If you enjoyed this episode, please join me for the next one in a week. As always, I love seeing your suggestions for artifacts and video topics in the comments. Today's topic was a viewer suggestion, and it was a nice change from all the terracotta and metal I've been painting recently. See you next time!